It's got a number of slides in it. There's lots of words in it, but I'm going to try and make it as painless as possible, just so that you don't have to do too much reading. But in essence, what I've been asked about is to talk about the regulatory framework when it comes to bunkering. In other words, when it comes to transshipment of oil. Firstly, we're going to start with SAMSA's objectives. As everybody should be aware by now, we are there for the safety of life and property at sea, as well as preventing pollution and combating pollution from ships in the marine environment, and then to promote the Republic's maritime interest. We are a flag state, a port state, and we also fulfill some of the duties of a coastal state. So that is how SAMSA fits into the picture. The principal acts giving effect to SAMSA is listed over there. I'm just pointing out basically the primary pollution acts that we're talking about. It's the Control and Civil Liability Act, the Prevention of Pollution by Ships Act, which is basically MARPOL, and then the Marine Pollution Intervention Act. And then following out from there, you also have your Civil Liability Convention Act, as well as the Merchant Shipping Act I can't read it, but IOPC basically. And then obviously we have the regulation for preventing marine pollution at sea. So with the Control and Civil Liability Act, what is the purpose of this act? I think it's quite important to understand that. The act is specifically designed to protect the marine environment from pollution. It is also there for prevention and combating of that pollution, and it is also to determine liability in case of an incident. So that is in essence the main purpose of the act. Take note, it's not just by oil, it's also by other harmful substances. So in order to move forward, it's important that we understand what some of the definitions are of what we are talking about. Harmful substance is any substance that, if introduced to the sea, is going to be a hazard to human health, living resources, and interfere with the legitimate uses of the sea, and includes oil. So it's also other substances. Then we have to drill down into looking at what a prohibited area is, because that is where SAMSA does a lot of its work. And what's important to note is internal waters form part of prohibited areas, as well as the EEZ, as well as territorial waters. And then when it comes to offshore installations, it's also the continental shelf. And then what is internal waters? Well, it's from the landward side, the waters landward of the baselines, as well as the harbors and all land between the high water mark and the low water mark. That is internal water, so that's where SAMSA has a focus. To look at it into context, that is a map of our baselines. The blue water is basically internal waters, so everywhere where you see blue is internal waters. Then you have obviously your 12 nautical miles, which is territorial waters, which starts where the baseline ends. And then obviously up there you can see Port Elizabeth and Kucha. That's the location of it. So if we drill down that a little bit further, we're talking about using Algoa Bay as a case study. Obviously you have a mothership over there, and there's going to be cargo transfers between the mothership and the bunker barges. Then you're going to have your bunker barge go to a vessel calling, and that's going to do bunker transfers. Then obviously the bunker barge needs to be topped up, and then it goes and do its next bunker transfer to another calling vessel. So that in essence is the cycle, and obviously for the mothership would also top itself up via cargo transfer in the bay itself. Now obviously cargo transfer, we do it in the ports as well, so it's not just related to offshore inclusive. And then obviously what we need to understand is the red line over there, that's port limits. The blue line is basically where the baseline is. And then what's important to note is this little drawing here at the bottom there. That green line is the marine protected area, and that line basically goes all the way up until the anchorage is over there. And from a SAMSA perspective, we don't allow any transfers to occur in the marine protected area. So basically all of this area over here is part of the marine protected area. And then the biggest question obviously is how do we manage the risk within this whole area, because oil knows no boundaries. In port, it's obviously easier to contain. You've got the breakwaters, the berths, but when it goes offshore, it's a little bit more difficult to contain that well. So that's why we have to ask ourselves that question, and why it's important for TMPA and SAMSA to work so closely together when it comes to managing that risk. In terms of the Control and Civil Liability Act, what is important to know is that the Act specifically says no person outside a harbour shall immobilise a vessel containing oil and other harmful substances, and within a prohibited area, and you've seen where the prohibited area is, transfer any oil or harmful substances without the permission of the authority. And that is between two ships, the laden ship and the receiving ship, inclusive of offshore installations. And in giving permission, it is basically, we're saying that if you're going to do that work, you're going to do it in this manner, whether it's regulatory based or whatever other conditions it is, such as including a tug. Tug is not the only condition that we give. Okay, and any condition obviously mean the where, when, how, and the what for that particular operation to take place. If you're moving forward, then you're going to talk to Section 7 of the Act as well. And what Section 7 basically says is that SAMSA can board a vessel that is calling in a prohibited area, and we can go look at that vessel at any time. For the vessel, we can look at any documentation that's got to do with marine pollution that they have to carry on board legally. And then obviously also what is important to understand is if we have reasonable grounds, we can also board your vessel. But I think it's very important to understand what regional clear grounds are and how that all fits into the picture, which is why we're bringing up the Prevention of Pollution Act, which is Act 2, and here we're talking specifically about Annex 1, and there it is about port state control. You would have realized I mentioned port state control a little bit earlier. Port state control is basically we go on board a foreign vessel, we inspect that vessel. If that vessel doesn't comply with any of the international maritime or the IMO mandatory conventions or anything that's applicable to that vessel, we'll obviously detain that vessel until such time that those deficiencies are fixed. And the port state control officer is a SAMSA surveyor. What is clear grounds? I think clear grounds is sometimes misunderstood by a lot, but in essence, when you have clear grounds, you can do a more detailed inspection of the vessel. I've taken some evidence, some things over here, it's not necessarily everything, but in essence, if we see that there's a shortcoming in terms of marble on board that vessel, or if there's evidence of cargo and other operations not being conducted safely in terms of any of the IMO guidelines and conventions, or if an incident occurs on board the vessel, we can technically go on board that vessel and port state that vessel at any time. So port state is not just every 6 months or so. If we have clear grounds, we can actually go further and dig. Further in terms of the regulations now, Chapter 5 is one that's always up to debate. Chapter 5 specifically deals with ship-to-ship oil transfers from one ship to another ship. Regulation 13 basically states that to whom that particular chapter shall not apply. So I've removed the other one out there so that you just focus on oil transfers. So in other words, if your tanker is based in a harbour, so tanker is defined as a laden ship, and transferring oil from such harbour into the fuel tanks of another ship, and that fuel must be for the latter's own use, so it's basically bunkers, then obviously those regulations 14 to 21 don't apply to you, but if it's not meeting those conditions, then it will apply to you. So for the transfer of oil, there needs to be an application to SAMSA, depending on what it is. Generally, for cargo transfers, we have certain criteria. For bunkers, we also have certain criteria, depending on whether there's a requirement for approval required or not. But in essence, you lodge an application at the PO, and then in the PO, we'll then come back to you, and we will need to know the reason for the transfer, if there's any damage on board the vessel, the name of the ships involved, the gross tons, the charterers, the names of the owners, the quantity of oils that you want to transfer. So these items are directly from the Act. or from the regulations in terms of what we need to ask, including which your P&I club is. In terms of Regulation 16, generally that deals with the receiving ship. So when we get a receiving ship 24 hours before it arrives, it's supposed to give us its certificate of fitness, a declaration basically stating that it is in a fit state to operate. It does not excuse the laden ship. So if there's a laden ship permanently operating on there, it will apply to them also mutatis mutandis. And then obviously if there's any changes, then that just needs to be updated. Regulation 17 deals with representing officers. If there's a transfer of oil happening, we may designate one or more officers to go on board that vessel. That person is appointed by SAMSA, or it can be appointed that we recognize to board that vessel. And in essence, it is to oversee the operation and satisfy himself or herself that it is done safely and properly, and that the person, whoever is doing the transfer and the ships, comply with the conditions that we have set. You have to have unhindered access, and then if we want the person to stay there for the duration of the transfer, he must have accommodation and meals. In terms of Regulation 18, this basically deals with the appointment of a POAC, which is a common name in the industry. In essence, if you're going to do a transfer which requires a POAC, then that POAC needs to be approved by SAMSA as per Regulation 18. The rest of the regulations deals with things that the vessels have to do, like the servicing of tugboats. There may be reasons why you need a tugboat. There may not be. Precautions that you have to take during the transfer operation, and then the duties of the person conducting the transfer. So that in essence speaks to the POAC and then the people involved on board. So if you're looking at the overall picture, those are, if you're not excluded from the regulations, those are 14 to 21. That's the regulations that will apply to you. So it applies to any cargo transfer, no matter where the location is, whether it's inside our harbour, within port limits, outside of port limits, in territorial waters. Those regulations will apply to you. If you are not based in the harbour and your oil is not obtained from the harbour and it's not going into the receiving tank of the vessel calling, then those regulations will apply to you. However, we have to keep in mind that in 1984, when these regulations were drafted, obviously we had no bunkering offshore yet. All the bunkering basically took place in port mainly, and that's, we're talking behind breakwater, and it was mainly via pipeline or via truck, and then subsequently via bunker barges operating in port only, like in Durban and Richards Bay. But the key challenge was also always in terms of interpreting the regulation itself. When does it apply? When does it not apply? What does a tanker based in the harbour mean? How do we know the tanker is based in the harbour if we are not informed? The oil obtained from such harbour, is it oil that is only imported? Is it oil that comes from a mothership? Is it oil that comes from a tanker on the coastal harbour? What makes it oil obtained from a harbour? And obviously, if those three things don't apply to you, then the question is, if your tanker is based and the oil is obtained from the harbour, then you don't have to apply. But if you're an operator where you don't get your oil from a harbour, but your tanker is based, then you need to apply for permission and those other things. So it gets kind of messy in terms of all of the applications that you need to press when and if and that sort of thing. But I think the key thing to remember is, if there is anything that is unclear, the Act always takes precedence over the regulations. So we always refer back to our Act. In terms of the current process that we are here, and here I'm talking specifically to how it used to be done. I'm not talking about how we may be doing it in the future. But in essence, a person applies. That person is basically a company. We verify that that person meets all the requirements in terms of policies, procedures, equipment, insurances. We then also look at the laden ship, the bunker tanker that they'll be using. We're looking at the condition here and whether they have the compliance, whether they meet the compliance requirements. We would also look at where they will be operating. We'll look at if they have a TMPA license Why that is important is because we have two authorities generally acting in the same space. You want to make sure that there's no conflicting stuff, that we say yes and PMPA says no, and that sort of thing. So we try and work quite closely together with each other, which is also why we all work together to draft the bunker codes to try and synergy everything. Then obviously the other things, other things is also then we're looking at how the oil transfers will be done. What is the conditions that we want to set to you? Do you have a contingency plan in place when things go wrong? In terms of the application that we receive for transfer oil, again, here we're looking at the laden ship and the receiving ship if it's applicable. In essence, we verify all of the information that you have. The receiving ships, we basically check, do you have the insurances and all of that? But it's not just about the insurances and that sort of thing. It's also so that we can charge a levy to the receiving ship when they arrive at the port. Because TMPA don't charge a levy. They only charge a levy when the vessel gets into port, so it's important that SAMSA is informed. And then obviously we also do annual inspections. And the key thing here is to make sure that the vessels meet the requirements of the Act regulations and MARPOL Chapter 8 Regulation 40-42 that deals specifically with ship-to-ship transfers. And the future, in essence, we have to make sure that people understand that if something happens, you could be held liable for any costs that is involved, and that includes in terms of rescuing, conveying and treating and feeding and cleaning any seabirds and that sort of thing that is affected, and you can be jointly held responsible for the other ship. Then there's the fines and penalties that is also applicable. If you don't apply to that, then obviously those are the things that will be our primary thing that we focus on is obviously MARPOL, especially when there's an oil spill. It could lead to 500,000 rand per person. The future state, we will be getting an amended bill that's currently going through the parliamentary process. After we get the MARPOL bill, we're going to have to review the regulations dealing with it. We're also going to have to look at how we bring in Annex 4.6 and the other annexes, because we have to update everything there. And then for the OPRC bill, when that comes in, it gives effect to the National Oil Spill Contingency Plan, site-specific plans, risk assessments, and a whole list of other things. It also gives powers of arrest. And then we have to draft regulations. And then obviously what's important is those objectives that I showed you in the beginning. That will change. Objective B will change. It will then incorporate also prevention, preparation, responding and combating in seaports, oil landing facilities and offshore installations. And that's it. Thank you very much.